Ladies and gentlemen, here is your host from his solar-powered shed in the Hudson Valley of New York. It's Pete Dominic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everybody. John Carroll. On the music, as always, I am your host. I'm happy to have you here on a Friday. Joining me today, comedian Christian Finnegan for his regular Finnegan Friday slot. And then I'll welcome for the very first time on the program a scholar, a civil rights attorney, and an advocate fighting racism all over the country, Jim Freeman, who has written a very important book, very, very important book that I learned a lot from, just enough to ask him questions about it. The book is called Rich Thanks to Racism, How the Ultra-Wealthy Profit from Racial Injustice. Really well researched, and we had an awesome conversation. Two excellent guests joining me on today's show. Sorry I couldn't be there for the hangout last night, but I moved it to tonight. So maybe you're someone who has never joined us because it's Thursdays at 8 Eastern, and maybe it's easier for you to join us at Fridays at 9 Eastern. I hope to see you tonight on Zoom. I think my dad is going to stop by the shed. I'm going to give him a microphone and have him sit behind me like my sidekick. That'll be fun. And so very excited. My mom, maybe he'll stop out as well, I hope, to the shed and hang out with us for a bit. And I might even bring a special Friday night guest as well. All right. So also very excited that we've gotten to enough listens per week, per day, that I'm able to sell advertising. I mean, I could have done ads a while ago, but the money was just not worth it to litter the show with ads. I want to source this program almost entirely from subscribers who hold me to task, keep my feet to the fire, keep me honest, as Anderson Cooper says, people who I get to know, who I trust and who have a lot of credibility. That's where I want this show to be mostly sourced by. But I'm excited because, I might do one or two reads a week. And if you're a paying subscriber and you don't like it, you want me an ad-free show, I'm happy to send that, make a list and send that to people. But what I'm going to do with the money from the advertising revenue on the program is I'm going to pay somebody to do a limited amount of work. I can't even hire them part-time, but somebody doing 10 hours of work to help me catch up so that I don't do things like I did this week, which was, I just didn't even think about 420 and doing some weed-related content or comedy or statistics, anything. And then I didn't think that it was Earth Day, and so I didn't do anything around that. Somebody that can, keep a schedule for me to some extent, say, hey, coming up is this holiday, this date, this anniversary. You should do something around that. We could all learn together, have a little fun with it. So someone to edit video, help me get the YouTube page that I've been wanting desperately to launch. So that's what I'm going to do with that revenue. So think about that as well. And you'll hear that later on. But I wanted to tell you that. Very excited about it and happy to talk with you and discuss any type of scheming and scamming. Everybody's basically a producer of this show, from content to opinions to even being guests, and obviously always telling me who to have on. We learn each and every day. It's a classroom where we learn how to make a difference, how to live better, healthier, more sane, enjoy each other more, and try to stay in the moment and learn together, growing all the time. That's what I've always tried to do. That's what we do today. And that is why now it's time to start our daily news segment, The Last 24. Here's what happened. Here's what you missed. Here's what you might not have missed, but you might want to hear again, and some context analysis and maybe stupid jokes around it. Starting with, of course, Earth Day. Lots to share with you. A lot of great clips for that. And I thought this was a great montage on MSNBC where the producers put together kind of a history of presidents and mainly Democratic leaders in this clip talking about the threat of the climate crisis, starting with 1985. I think this is Senator Al Gore.
Now more than ever, we stand at the door of opportunity, wondering whether the door will close before we act to control the greenhouse effect.
We simply must halt global warming. It is a threat to our health, to our ecology, and to our economy.
There's some basic facts about global warming. It's real simple. The science is real, the effects are profound, and inaction is not an option.
And today I call on all countries to join us. Not next year or the year after that, but right now.
Climate change is real, it's urgent, And America can take the lead in the world in addressing it, right?
Mother Nature is giving us a very clear and powerful message. We've got to stop that. We've got to wake up and recognize the need for change.
So what happened? How come all of those leaders, American Democrats, all of them, failed to really make a huge difference? I mean, I'd argue President Obama really did get a lot done. Each of them did things. Many, you heard speeches, at least in the rhetoric. So what's wrong? Why couldn't they get it done? Why were Democrats insufficient at bringing enough attention to the risk and the threat, much less offer solutions? And why should we even talk about Democrats, conservatives on the right who were in complete denial of the science as soon as they realized that it was going to cost something? Well, a lot has changed in terms of the economies of green energy. Coal is dead almost entirely, and wind and solar are so much cheaper. You've got freaking pickup trucks and Hummers, and every single automobile manufacturer in the world is making an electric car. I don't know if they were serious when Volkswagen said they were going to change their name to Volkswagen, but many of you have solar panels like me, an electric car like myself. So what changed? Well, I think it's us. I mean, politicians, the ones that wanted to get things done, couldn't get things done as long as they didn't have overwhelming public support. That's kind of always the case on all of the biggest issues, the most existential issues where there aren't huge lobbies advocating and giving money to politicians. But listen, the truth is there's always been great writers writing about this. Always like to shout out my friend Steve Chase, who's been my mentor for the last over 10 years on this issue, connecting me with nature and the greatest nature writers of our time, environmentalists, scientists, advocates, journalists, and of course, academics. And so they've all been screaming. I mean, they have known for a long time. My friend Dr. Michael Mann at Penn State, James Hansen at NASA, they've known for a long time. So what happened? What was the problem? It was us. It was us. I mean, I tried to lead at SiriusXM. I tried as much as I could to be an early adapter to all of these technologies, and a lot of you joined me, and some of you led me and continue to, but it was us. Their change is coming. It is here, and even if we don't like it. So we've got about 10 years, some like to argue. Who knows if that's even accurate? Tough to tell. But here is President Joe Biden yesterday on Earth Day making some pretty ambitious announcement. This is an edited cut up of him.
By maintaining those investments and putting these people to work, the United States sets out on the road to cut greenhouse gases in half by the end of this decade. All of us, and particularly those of us who represent the world's largest economies, we have to step up because scientists tell us that this is the decisive decade. This is the decade we must make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis.
Last night on MSNBC, Chris Hayes had Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, who has been a vociferous advocate on the climate crisis. He's given hundreds of speeches about it. He asked him for his reaction to the president's announcement and agenda today.
I think it's great. This was at the leading edge of the plausible window of options. And, 50% plus by 2030 is a real serious commitment.
All right. Well, that was succinct. I didn't think he was going to end there. Sheldon Whitehouse. I love that guy. Chris Hayes also asked him, though, the bigger question, how do we get there from here with Republican obstructionism? And Sheldon Whitehouse surprised him by basically insinuating there might be some Republicans that might surprise you on some of the more subtle issues and trying to change their opinions when it comes to climate and the fact that, by the way, green energy has become so much more economical and now attractive.
Well, I think for starters, I think there will be a big climate bill. I think that the Build Back Better jobs bill will be that climate bill. And we're going to work very hard to make sure that it is that climate bill. And behind that comes Glasgow and the World Conference to update the Paris Agreement and perhaps another round of legislation to fill in for that. And in the Senate right now, there are bills moving forward on industrial emissions, on agricultural emissions, on oceans-related issues, and a lot of these are bipartisan. So you're right, something has shifted, and the momentum is gathering and growing, and I think we just have to lean in as hard as we can and make sure we're doing everything we can along the way. And I think for the first time, after many, many years of despair and frustration about this, I'm starting to feel that we're going to get there.
Sheldon Whitehouse on MSNBC last night. We got to get him on Stand Up with Pete Dominic. Also, we heard from young Greta Thunberg, who called on Congress to enact more concrete measures on climate change when she appeared virtually before a House subcommittee yesterday. She said, "We are the ones who get to decide how you will be remembered." Let's listen.
It is the year 2021. The fact that we are still having this discussion, and even more that we are still subsidizing fossil fuels directly or indirectly using taxpayer money, is a disgrace. The gap between what we are doing and what actually needs to be done in order to stay below the 1.5 degrees Celsius target is widening by the second. And the simple fact, an uncomfortable fact, is that if we are to live up to our promises and commitments in the Paris Agreement, we have to end fossil fuel subsidies, stop new exploration and extraction, completely divest from fossil fuels, and keep the carbon in the ground. And it may seem like we are asking for a lot. And you will, of course, say that we are naive. And that's fine. But at least we are not so naive that we believe things will be solved through countries and companies making vague, distant, insufficient targets without any real pressure from the media and the general public. How long do you honestly believe that people in power like you will get away with it? How long do you think you can continue to ignore the climate crisis, the global aspect of equity and historic emissions, without being held accountable? You get away with it now, but sooner or later people are going to realize what you have been doing all this time. That's inevitable. You still have time to do the right thing and to save your legacies. But that window of time is not going to last for long. We, the young people, are the ones who are going to write about you in the history books. We are the ones who get to decide how you will be remembered. So my advice for you is to choose wisely.
I love her. Love her. Such great commentary. 0 F's to give. And a young person leading young people. Great, great, great. Also heard from other world leaders yesterday. Here is a German Chancellor Angela Merkel, through a translator, of course.
Mr. President, dear Joe Biden,
dear colleagues,
Joe Biden. I'm delighted to see that the United States is back to work together with us in climate politics, because there can be no doubt about the world needing your contribution if we really want to fulfill our ambitious goals. And the national contribution of the United States for 2030 is a clear illustration of your ambitions. That is a very clear and important message to the international community. Thank you for this, and thank you for organizing this summit.
Okay, and we also heard from the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, who said we will strictly limit the increase in coal consumption.
We will continue to prioritize ecological conservation and pursue a green and low-carbon path to development. China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. China has committed to move from carbon peak to carbon neutrality in a much shorter time span than what might take many developed countries, and that requires extraordinarily hard efforts from China. Support is being given to encourage peaking pioneers from localities, sectors, and companies. We will strictly control coal-fired power generation projects. We will strictly limit the increase in coal consumption over the 14th five-year plan period and phase it down in the 15th five-year plan period.
Okay, I don't know exactly what that means, but it seems like the right direction, maybe not quickly enough. And here is John Kerry on the Biden administration's climate commitments. He's the climate czar, I think. He was out at the press briefing yesterday with Gina McCarthy.
I believe in what the young folks are doing out there today. They're trying to get adults to be adults and do what we're supposed to do, which is take facts into consideration and respond to those facts. And as public officials, exercise the precautionary principle of governance. That when you get information that says X, Y, and Z are going to happen, and there's not a 5 or 6 or 10% chance it's going to happen, like whether you might have a car accident and you get insurance, or your home might burn and you get insurance, or you might get sick and you get health insurance, it's 100% certain that most of these things are going to happen, that the ice is melting, that the sea is rising, that warming, and yet we're not buying insurance. And so you're darn right they're angry, and I share that anger. It's frustration. But how do you get from here to there to get it done? And I believe what President Biden is doing is leading to get us from here to there. What's happening here today is a huge step forward to get us from here to there. By setting these targets, by getting nations invested, by getting leaders to say publicly, we have to do this, you begin to get a foothold on holding them accountable and on moving forward and getting it done. Is it enough? No. But it's the best we can do today and prove we can begin to move and get the technologies and find the easier path and then hopefully get the job done. And I really believe that. I think we will get the job done, as President Biden said today, because of our capacity for innovation and research and development and producing great products in the future and meeting big challenges. And we've always done that. And I think Americans are really anxious to do something like that.
All right, that's enough from John Kerry, but really good stuff. I've always liked him for a lot of different reasons, despite his vote for the Iraq War, which I think he later regretted. And also, he did a lot. He's made some pretty big deals. The Iran deal, the Paris climate deal. I think he made up for it for one man. At least that's what I think. Maybe you're more cynical than me, and that's fine. All right, so that's a potpourri of audio for you on climate, on the climate crisis, on Earth Day. I highly recommend that you read about it, get involved with it. I think I'm going to print that Greta Thunberg quote out and hang it up on both my daughter's walls, see how long that stays up. But I have, obviously, will continue to keep talking about this issue and live in this issue and discussing this issue. I actually gave a talk to Penn State yesterday, a virtual talk about sustainability and jobs and sustainability, something I know a little bit about, and another thing I know a lot about is making it interesting. So that was great. I'm going to keep doing that work. You let me know who I should be talking to, what I should be reading, what I should be saying, what you are thinking, what initiatives you're involved with when it comes to the environment, sustainability, and slowing the climate crisis and creating jobs all while we're doing it. Okay, so I do want to move on to just a couple of other issues that happened yesterday, including the fact that for the second time in American history, the House voted to make Washington, D.C. A state, of course, along partisan lines. But here is the great Michelle Goldberg, who is New York Times columnist. She used to join me regularly over at SiriusXM. She was on MSNBC talking about the arguments against making D.C. a statehood. Of course, we heard, by the way, from one congresswoman, Republican congresswoman yesterday, saying that D.C. only has 700,000 people. It wouldn't qualify to even be, enough for a district. And she said that while standing right next to the only congresswoman from Wyoming, which has, I think, 600,000 people in it, Liz Cheney, standing right next. And they have her as well at their estate, and they have 2 senators. So ridiculous disproportion amount of power. But let me shut up and play the brilliant Michelle Goldberg.
Right. The only Republican argument, there are 2 Republican arguments against statehood for D.C. One, that it will benefit Democrats, and 2, that there's something about the people of D.C. that they don't deserve representation. Yes. And indeed, the contempt with which members of our government speak about residents of D.C., I think, is a sign of how badly they need representation.
And also, John Oliver on HBO's Last Week Tonight explained this very well, and I'll play just a couple minutes of him talking about it.
But look, you can understand why many people in DC are angry, because think about it. They pay federal taxes and fight in wars, and yet have no member of Congress who's able to vote on their behalf, even though their population is larger than Vermont and Wyoming, and their gross domestic product is higher than that of 16 states. And if you're thinking, well, isn't this just how countries treat their capital cities? It actually isn't. We're the only democracy in the world that does this. In fact, when the Dalai Lama came to visit, he wondered why a small pocket of people living in the world's champion of democracy lacked full voting rights, calling it quite strange, quite strange. And it is not good when a guy from Tibet says, wow, this situation is really undemocratic. Someone should do something about it. Does Richard Gere know about this? Someone should tell him. Now, to be fair, DC does have a member of Congress, Eleanor Holmes Norton, but there are some strict limits on her powers.
I vote in committee, but I cannot do that which every American would believe is emblematic of citizenship. And that is vote on the House floor, vote on whether your taxes go up or go down, vote on whether you go to war or not. Can't do that.
So she basically has pretend power. Like a child watching Dora the Explorer. Oh, yeah. Dora took her map out of her backpack because you told her to. Just keep believing that, you tiny idiot. Just grow up.
All right, well, that is all the sound clips I've gathered for you today. There's a lot more news on the Supreme Court, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh and other conservative justices just completely throwing out the idea of stare decisis or just caring at all about the precedent. Previous Supreme Court decisions. That was big news yesterday. Also, the U.S. Senate just passed the COVID-19 hate crimes bill in a bipartisan vote, 94-1. Only one senator voted against the hate crimes bill designed to limit the sharp increase in hate crimes against Asian and Pacific Island Americans. Who was it? Nope. You'd be wrong if you said Ted Cruz. It's actually the other asshole. Well, there are many. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, whose vote against the anti-hate crimes bill may be one day viewed as the worst thing he did, although there are plenty of moments that you can choose from with this creep. Anyway, I'm actually excited because I'll be interviewing Senator Mazie Hirono later on today. She's the first senator joining me here on the podcast. See, things are going good. I'm telling you, we're growing. We're getting great guests, and I couldn't do it without you. Anyway, I'm excited to talk with her about that. That's another big issue from yesterday. And the COVID-related headlines that I saw, 315 cases in one day in India where they are fighting for oxygen. Horrible situation in India. The Pope announced a marathon month of prayer to end the pandemic, so that should make a huge difference. Rates in Los Angeles have gone from the worst, to among the best. Cuba infections have hit a new high. Japan is seeking a, quote, short and powerful state of emergency as the virus is raging there. And the lift on the pause in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine could come as early as today. That's been the speculation all week. Yeah, I'm reading now that South Africa, the EU, have moved forward with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. No cases of clots were reported among the 290,000 healthcare workers across the country who received the Johnson & Johnson. Also saw that the vaccines are apparently effective against the New York variant, according to one study. And those are your COVID headlines, at least the ones that I could dig up for you. And now it's time to get to everything else. It's not politics, not COVID, but still important, consequential, or at least interesting. It's time for your news dump. And here's listener subscriber Pete Coe with yet another news dump jingle.
Wild horses running round, see it buck and jump. It's nibbling grandma's wig on today's news dump.
Why is grandma anywhere near the horse? Why is she wearing a wig? I have a lot of questions about that scenario. Man, I look forward to those. I really look forward to those. I hope you are as well now. Keep them coming, Pete Coe. And anybody else that wants to contribute, by all means, send them our way. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Let's start in that crazy state of Florida that so many of you live in, where the Florida Supreme Court dealt a potentially fatal blow to supporters of a proposed constitutional amendment aimed at legalizing marijuana under certain circumstances. Just really unbelievable. Mark Joseph Stern tweeted, the Florida Supreme Court's anti-weed decision today is so bizarre and illogical that it's pretty clear the result of 5 justices hostility to marijuana legalization and self-governance, rather than any plausible reflection of the law. Read him at Slate. Florida Republicans are the worst. They just shot themselves in the dick again. Sunshine State hates the money that comes from solar and cannabis. Ugh. Also wanted to mention yesterday was the 17th anniversary of the death of former Arizona Cardinals football player Pat Tillman, who left the NFL to enlist in the U.S. Army after 9/11, turning down a $3.6 million contract at 25 years old. Pat Tillman was killed by friendly fire, and the Bush administration covered it up. Dude was really complex, and the whole thing sucks. I interviewed his wife, Marie Tillman, and his organization that she created, Pat Tillman Fund, does great work. But I wanted to mention that. Read the John Krakauer book about all of that, called Where Men Win Glory, the Odyssey of Pat Tillman. Very good work, as John Krakauer always is, right? In Kansas, the governor, who's a Democrat, Laura Kelly, vetoed a Republican measure that would have made Kansas the latest state with a GOP-controlled legislature to ban transgender athletes from girls' and women's school sports. Her action was widely expected because she'd labeled the bill regressive and said it would hurt the state's ability to recruit businesses. Conservative Republican lawmakers did not have the two-thirds majorities necessary in both chambers to override a veto when they pushed it to passage earlier this month. Ugh. Kansas Republicans are pretty bad, too. The Republican platform at state level right now seems to do everything they can to suppress likely Democratic voters, especially people of color, and make it really hard for people who are transgender to live a happy, healthy lives. So gross. What else am I missing? Guns, abortion. Yeah, of course. Tensions on the Russia-Ukraine border are coming down a little bit, I guess. Russia's defense minister ordered troops back to their permanent bases after a massive exercise in Crimea, but said they should leave their heavy weapons behind for another exercise in western Russia. But the headline at ABC News is Russia orders troop pullback, but keeps weapons near Ukraine. The bill to purge early voting unexpectedly failed in Arizona, by the way. That's good news. An explosion at a gender reveal party rocked several towns. Ooh, really? Still with this? Police say the source of the explosion in New Hampshire that rocked several towns and could be felt as far away as Massachusetts was a gender reveal party. Really? Apparently, the guy had 80 pounds of an explosive called tannerite, and the family thought the quarry would be the safest spot to blow up the explosive, which typically sold over the counter, as a target for firearms practice. No injuries were reported. Police said an investigation is ongoing, and I still don't know or care what the gender of this family's baby is going to be. Thought this was a funny/gross headline. It says, with Britain opening up, many bathrooms are closed. Outdoor excrement is a serious problem. 58% are going to look for a new job if they were forced to return to the office. I really think that's interesting. New study saying working from home makes us more productive. How about that? Does that mean we're working more as well? The leader of the Bay City Rollers, the frontman, Les McCone, has passed away, as has iconic hip-hop artist Shock G of Digital Underground passed away at the age of 57, according to TMZ. I just saw that as I'm wrapping up the news dump as well. That is today's news dump. And now it's time to tell you about what is this? Oh, yes. What was your first job? What was your best job? I want to know. My first job was working at the New York State Fair making popcorn. My best job is this one. But in between, doing stand-up comedy and being on TV and the radio, it's all been great. I've really enjoyed and can only do jobs that I like. How about you? I'd love to know. Best job, worst job, first job. How about that? Oh, my worst job was definitely painting. I was horrible at painting, both inside and outside. Nobody wants me to paint anything with a paintbrush, including my wife. She does all that at our house. But if you're looking for a job or you're looking to hire somebody, you're the hiring expert for your company, what you really need to do is make a short list of quality candidates, and that could be really hard. So you need a partner who makes your life easier. You need Indeed, folks. Indeed is the job site that makes hiring really easy. You can just post, screen, and interview everything 1, 2, 3 right on Indeed. I was just on their website because I knew I was going to do this, and it's great. You get your quality shortlist of candidates whose resumes on Indeed match your job description faster. Only pay for the candidates that meet the must-have qualifications that you demand of your talented people. And you schedule and complete video interviews on your Indeed dashboard. Indeed makes connecting with and hiring the right talent fast and easy. And with tools like the Indeed Instant Match, it gives you the quality candidates whose resume on Indeed fits your job description immediately. And Indeed skills tests that, on average, reduce hiring time by 27%. And that is a lot of time right there. That's a quarter of the time that you have, 27%. You can choose from more than 130 skills tests, or you can even add your own. I got to do that. I got to take the skills test, too, see if I have any. Then add your must-have requirements so you can only pay the applications that meet them. According to Talent Nest, which is the name of my old band, Indeed delivers 4 times more hires than all other job sites combined. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are hiring, you need Indeed. Get started right now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/standup. Get a $75 credit at Indeed.com/standup. Indeed.com/standup. Offer valid June through June 30th. Terms and conditions apply. Nailed it. Indeed.com/standup. Go now. Okay, now it's time for your favorite guest of the week, because he's here every week and he always makes sense about everything. As a matter of fact, last week, longtime listener, supporter, and heavy-duty subscriber. I'm not saying you're heavy-duty, Jason. Well, he's a big guy. I'm saying that he's very generous with his subscription to this podcast. Jason Moe left me a Polo, which is the video app that I use to talk with a lot of folks. And he left me a long message. Not a long message, but I love talking to this guy anytime. But he left me a message, and part of it, he talked about Christian Finnegan, who is, by the way, headlining the DC Improv tonight and tomorrow night. Still tickets available, I think, for tonight. Here's what Jason had to say about Christian Finnegan. I played it for Christian, and then you can hear him react to it as well. Jason's in his big truck making noise. Sorry about that. Here we go.
Christian Finnegan is something fucking special. I don't know what it is, man, and I think I've said this before. Every time it's like every Friday, it's like it's the perfect end to my week. And I think it's because he's so succinct in how he speaks, and his word economy is fucking ballsy, dude. Like, not ballsy, that's the wrong word. His word economy is perfection. Like, he uses his vocabulary with like a fucking weapon, and he's able to pack a whole lot of sentiment into very few words, which, as you know, I'm the opposite. I say a whole lot of shit without saying anything. But I really love that about him for some reason.
All right, so there you go.
It's so funny because I feel the opposite about myself all the time. But
that was very nice. I'm recording now, and I wanted you to hear that. He's a great guy. He's one of my longest favorite listeners. I look up to him. I think he's got great values, and he's just so thoughtful. He's always one to give a compliment. But it was last weekend when we were just about to get ready to tape. You couldn't do it, and I was disappointed because he wants to end his week with you, and I really wanted to play that for you. And I was like, you know, I miss you when we don't get to talk, and so did a lot of other people. So I'm glad that you're able to join me this week.
Yeah, that's why I didn't want to miss 2 weeks in a row, and I knew that tomorrow was going to be a real pain in the ass. So I'm glad we're making it work tonight.
So thank you for joining me. And you are on your way to DC, Washington, DC this weekend, and people will hear this in time if they want, if they're in and around the area. Maybe there's some tickets left. I know most of the shows are sold out, but DC Improv, back doing comedy. How does it feel?
I'm completely nervous about it. Utterly. I'm not nervous about doing comedy. I've been doing stand-up consistently, for the past few months on
virtually,
crappy rooftop shows.
And
virtually, but also, a lot of the clubs in New York have been doing outdoor shows. And I just started, now that I'm fully vaccinated, I have been doing indoor shows again, but 45 minutes where I'm the guy, where it's my show. I haven't done that in certainly I haven't done that in a non-virtual scenario in a long time. And so I'm nervous about it just because I really want it to go well. I want it to be fun for them and also fun for me. And it's more fun for me if I go into it with confidence, knowing like what material I'm doing and where I feel like I can, you know how it is when you don't really know your material, you spend so much of your mental energy trying to think about your set list and what comes next that you're not really open to the tangent and crowd work stuff that kind of makes the shows unpredictable and fun, you know? So I'm kind of watching there's certain jokes that I plan on doing this weekend that I haven't done recently. So I'm kind of relearning some of the material. I'm just so jazzed. I think everybody's going to be very relaxed about it because everybody knows it's a weird scenario and everybody expects a little bit of rust. So
I always feel like the drive to the gig is where a lot of things come together. So you're driving down to DC.
So weird. Yeah.
And you're going to be.
Yeah. I plan on, that's really how I plan on spending the 4.5 hour drive. It's just listening to my set and actually saying it out loud. You know, sometimes just literally, you know how it is. Sometimes writing out your set list will help you remember it, and actually saying the words with your mouth helps you remember them. There's an actual muscle memory as opposed to just kind of reading and be like, oh, right, that bit, then that bit, then that bit.
How much of your new, you know, this hour is 45 minutes that you're doing headlining now will be dealing with things, COVID, pandemic? I just feel like when I go back to comedy, that all of anything I've ever said, it just doesn't matter. Like life before the pandemic is so much different than life during and post. And it also just feels like rich for comedy. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a third for me. You know, some of the material that I was doing before the pandemic doesn't work anymore. Some of the pandemic material doesn't really work anymore. I mean, some of the stuff about the early days of the pandemic, I mean, you could reframe it as, remember when we were all experiencing X? But, you know, I don't want the whole show to be pandemic, because I think one of the things that everyone is feeling right now is an excitement about the future. And I'm not saying the grand future, you know, 10 years from now. I'm saying like summer, you know, people, there's kind of a feeling of like, I want to go out and have fun and I want to go out and feel engaged. And some of that is just the natural change of the seasons. But I don't want it all to be just we're all locked in our houses. Aren't we miserable? Which is what a lot of the comedy, at least virtually, was in 2020.
Right. Well, I'm excited to see and hear what happens, and everybody check out Christian if you're in or around DC this weekend at the Improv. Great club.
Yeah, I think Saturday the 2 shows Saturday are sold out, but I think there's still a few tickets for Friday.
Awesome.
So that's literally would be tonight.
That's right. That's when I'll be posting it for Friday. Our conversation. So I also obviously always want to talk with you, but kind of we talk on Fridays and usually recap some of the stories of the week. This week was obviously dominated by the final week of the Derek Chauvin trial and the verdict for all 3 counts, of course, guilty, and all of everything around, of course, like while the verdict was being read, other black people were being shot and killed by the police. So there was like no time to kind of, I mean, that was the reaction. And I think that the thing that we hear so much from black folks that I see and hear so much is we're exhausted. And so I want to talk about the whites with you. What do you make of the reaction, generally speaking, you know, of the people who didn't like the verdict or wanted it to be different? I mean, I don't know how we gauge such a reaction other than social media and kind of cable news. But it was interesting to see how some people were disappointed and a lot of the likeliest suspects and some not so much.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny. Greg Kelly, the Newsmax host, basically wasn't even saying that he was angry about it. He was just saying kind of, hey, the verdict is the verdict. And I could have seen it going either way. And so many people was like, you too, like calling him Judas. Like, how dare you, that he had somehow betrayed his race. Essentially, he was a race traitor for not being furious about the verdict. You know, first go to POV for the people who are upset is that this jury was somehow intimidated into voting, for finding him guilty, which, I don't know how you can say that's true when they return the verdict so quickly. Like, if it had been days upon days of drawn out deliberations and notes back to the judge saying, asking for clarification, then maybe I could see your point. But, this was a pretty quick verdict. And to have 3 just straight up guilty verdicts as opposed to finding him guilty on one and letting him off the hook. Like, if they really were just trying to avoid scrutiny or, avoid the maelstrom of rage that would result from their finding him guilty, I don't think they would have found him guilty in all 3, personally. And also, it's one of those arguments that's perfect for the perpetually aggrieved, because there's no way to disprove it. You know what I mean? But I want to ask these people, is there any way he could have been found guilty in your mind that it wouldn't have been intimidation? Like, is there, because I don't know how more declarative a verdict could be than this one. So what is what you're saying, that there is no way that he could have been found guilty and it would have been the appropriate sentence? Is that your point of view? If so, say so. Say that he's innocent. He should have been let off,
It's such a big deal. It's hard to prove a negative, but had it gone any other way, it would have been just so disheartening, simply because we shouldn't compare every single interaction between black folks and police or white folks and police as the same when black people are killed or anybody's killed by police officers. But this is different. We saw the entire thing. And so if it had gone differently, the reaction would be, well, listen, by police, we can do anything we want. We can be videotaped over a long period of time. It wasn't a split-second decision over a long period of time where people are telling us to stop, and it would have given cops carte blanche. It would have been so much worse. And I don't know if we even need to talk about that. Proving
it would tell you that there is no bottom. There is no bottom.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so absurd to me that we were put in a position where we were even nervous about this. I think I tweeted something to the effect of, like, think if you were talking to someone who lived in a society where justice was valued and applied equally. Think of how absurd they would find it that we were nervous about this trial. You know what I mean? But we've been down the road before, and you do start to wonder, is it possible to hold anyone guilty of crimes that some indict white culture at large or law enforcement at large? Is it possible? Is it possible to hold the people who are in power liable for their actions? And if he had been found innocent, it would be very difficult to make the argument that there was any accountability whatsoever.
Yeah.
So it's like, all right, we found absolute zero. We've found the one end of the continuum. Like, all right, so the rule is you can't kneel on a black person's neck for 9.5 minutes with your hands in your pockets like a fucking piece of shit. That's still the part of it that makes me the most angry when I see, I haven't watched the video since the original incident, but when I see pictures of him with his fucking hands in his pockets, as if to tell the people, I'm not doing anything to make pressure putting on this person. Like, I'm not bracing myself in the car to make sure I don't hurt him. I am leaning into it, and my hands are in my pocket because this is just a walk in the park for me. The insulting, the impunity, you can't do anything about this. And look how casual I am. My hands are in my pockets. And maybe I'm reading into that. Maybe there's some sort of police training reason why his hands are in his pockets. I don't understand how that could possibly be. But all right, so we've now established that that police officers can't do that. That's a pretty ridiculous standard.
Yeah.
Like, is that really where it has to? Is that the line that has to be crossed?
I've been listening to this week. I forced myself to listen to a bunch of popular right wing shows, and it's fascinating. I don't know if you've done that. in a while, but
I really have a hard time.
Oh, it was brutal. Actually, I'm not going to lie to you. I partially listened to them to see how a podcast, Ben Shapiro and this awful person, Steven Crowder, who is just, he's horrendous, but mainly because he thinks he's funny. And that's more upsetting than anything else. But I listened to them to see how they kind of like promoted their shows and how they just the technical, infrastructure of the way they talked about the podcast, to think if I could learn anything, because they do a good job at promoting their podcast. But what I learned was, was reminded, is that they tell such a great narrative. They create such a great narrative for their listeners.
It's a clean narrative too.
What do you mean by that?
It's there's no loose ends to it. It's very simple. It's very coherent. And it's, life isn't coherent. Life is jagged and messy and full of tangents and, dangling strings. But these guys create a vision of life that is very easy to swallow and where you are always the hero/victim.
Yes. Yes. And one of the things that they do very effectively, and liberals do this too, but just not as effectively, and we don't think this way as much, is they're constantly talking about what they don't tell you. Liberals do this too, but the media specifically doesn't tell you about this black man who killed this white person, or that more white people are killed by police. They tell a story, they cherry pick statistics, and they use a lot of anecdotes. And man, if I didn't know the truth, I would be convinced by that, which is why they're so popular. And by the way, Christian, Ben Shapiro does about 5 minutes, then reads an ad. Does about 5 more minutes, then reads an ad, like 7 or 8 ad breaks in his hour-long show. And I was like, wow, how do people get through that? But anyway.
Yeah, I guess, the clips that float through my Twitter feed occasionally, which I don't even bother clicking on them anymore, but I've certainly watched a few in the past. And now you telling me that tells me that, I've watched an entire segment. Like that was it. That wasn't some excerpt. That wasn't some 2.5 minute excerpt from a 45-minute discussion. It's like, no, that was his dumb little blurb about subject X. And, and we've talked about this off camera, off mic, that, that's how successful shows operate. They have little bite-sized chunks. It's not some long,
And true of liberals too. Like, I love this David Pakman show, but they do these segments because that's how the algorithms work, and on YouTube especially. So, but my thing is always trying to find the smartest people I can talk to. And
I'm sorry you failed and that I'm here with you today.
I know there's so many other people who were unavailable today and every Friday apparently, but he doesn't. It's like when people make a smart argument, even if it's not political, and you buy it and it's convincing until you hear a smarter one, and you never hear the pushback against his bullshit or any of them. You don't get that other perspective, and it's just so bizarre to me that people don't realize.
Well, again, though, because it's an uncomplicated vision of life, and I don't know whether Ben Shapiro off mic has a much more nuanced vantage point on life than what he presents on camera. Maybe it is completely cynical, and that he's like, I've learned how to, turn myself into a professional wrestler, or I have this character that I do. And then off mic, I might admit that there's a lot of variation and nuance to the subjects I'm, ranting about. Or maybe he just wakes up and he has a very simple, nuance-free view of life, and that's, I think, one of the problems that someone like you has, someone like me, a lot of people that we communicate with, is that we question ourselves. Even sometimes as opinions are coming out of my mouth, it occurs to me, do I really feel that way? Is that the entirety of my opinion on this topic? And it can lead to much to the nice person who left that message for you, talking about economy of words. I don't often feel like that, because sometimes I feel like I have to double back on something I just said because I'm taking in other perspectives.
Sure.
But these guys, they got it all figured out. They have that junior high debate club attitude towards life.
It helps media-wise to break things down into sound bites that are digestible. It helps people want to watch your show. I mean, Tucker Carlson obviously does that every night as well. But and then the Steven Crowder kid, this guy is constantly talking about trans people and sports. And number one, it's weird to beat the same drum a lot, but that issue to me is such an uninteresting issue in that it's not really much of an issue, meaning the trans community is so small and so unconsequential to the overall, social fabric of America. And it's great what's happening in that community, obviously, and what's changing. But the idea that it's a problem for anybody is hard to imagine how anybody would care. I mean, we could talk about, the gay community too, but the gay community is far more pervasive, and there are far more gay people and just equal rights and so on. And we've gotten through so much with LGB, now with T, the idea that you can get married and don't ask, don't tell and all that. But just the idea, Christian, that he beats on this issue, trans people all day. I always think the same thing. I'm like, you are definitely gay yourself, first of all. Like, you can't possibly care about this issue so much unless you're struggling. I always think that when people are railing on sexual issues.
I mean, to me, it's a bit of a sign of progress in an ironic way, because the battle lines have moved so clearly.
Good point. Yeah.
The fight over, trans women in sports is now
all four of them.
Is now the battlefield that gay marriage was during the Bush administration. So that's change. That's change. And this is where they have retreated to, because that is where there's always a demarcation point that sort of animates the sort of lizard brain conservatism of the average person. And I'm talking lowercase conservatism, not political conservatism, but there's always a point of weirdness, quote unquote, to culture where certain people are just like, okay, that's just too weird for me. Do you know what I mean? And that used to be someone admitting they were gay in public. And then it became two men holding hands in public. And then it became gay people being able to live together and not being able to be discriminated against in housing. Then it became gay people getting married, and so that line that sort of triggers the average person's, emotional gag reflex has moved to trans girls somehow dominating high school sports, which to me, like you said, it's hilariously small of a problem. It's a solution in search of a problem. How about we wait? Give it 5 years, give it 6 years to see how many girl sports are being dominated by trans athletes before we preemptively create all this legislation to address this problem that nobody even knows if it's a problem yet. But they need to do something to animate that emotional gag reflex in their listeners. And that's where that exists now. Because if they rant about gay marriage, they just sound silly because they've already lost that argument because nobody cares. Even their listeners don't care.
I wonder.
They don't care anymore.
Yeah, well, not about gay marriage, yeah, for sure, but about this trans, I can't imagine anybody caring about that. You don't know anybody. Anyway, I also, this week, we saw George W. Bush on the Today Show, and I really got upset. Number one, because Jenna Bush is on the Today Show, so it's like family there, and so Hoda Kotb was like, just, gave a fine interview about him, coming out and being a painter and everything. I'm sure that was all agreed upon ahead of time, but I really got upset. I mean, it's so easy to think that George W. Bush was a decent president. Or after Trump, you look back and think maybe it wasn't so bad, but George W. Bush was in so many ways far worse or as bad as Trump in just the Iraq war alone and so many other things. I just felt like there's this spectrum of horror and evil and terrible things that you can do as a president of the United States, and he's second for sure in our lifetime, without a doubt. We lived through it. It bothered me. Did you pay any attention to that? Do you think
only in the sense that it floated through my social media channels, but I understand what you mean. And we may have talked about this before, but I have this general belief that there is what's called internal goodness and external goodness, or morality, for lack of a better word, morality and external morality. And when I say internal morality, I'm talking about like holding a door for people, not lying to people, when you borrow money, you pay it back. You know, the simple person-to-person goodness that we expect from the people surrounding us. And when I talk about external morality, I'm talking about not starting war with Iraq, you know, not supporting a racist cop who clearly murdered someone on camera. You know, I'm talking about kind of big picture morality. And I think the disconnect with Bush is that Trump was internally bad and externally bad. He was a bad person and he did bad things on a macro political level. Whereas George W. Bush was externally bad, but internally good, at least from people say. He was nice to them. He was polite. He would joke around. He was affable. And so compared to Trump on an internal morality level, Bush is a better person. And it's hard not to appreciate that. And I do think that there is a political importance to having an internally good person at the head of your government.
Yes. And just to add to that, he had empathy and he understood what love meant.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. He loved people, and you could tell people loved him.
You could tell.
I don't believe anybody truly loves Donald Trump, and I truly love anybody. I genuinely don't believe that. I think his kids are afraid of him, and they seek his approval, but it's not a healthy human love, I don't think. But so that kind of difference on a personal level between Bush and Trump makes it easy sometimes to forget how much damage his presidency did to
really well said. I'm glad I asked you about that. That's a great way of explaining the difference between the two men. You shared on Twitter a video of you knocking on your father's door and surprising him. You drove up to Massachusetts and surprised your dad, saw your dad for the first time in how long? And it was so great.
Yeah,
so you to share it.
It was fun. I we were both fully vaccinated, and I hadn't seen him since at least Thanksgiving 2019. It could have even been earlier. I'm not sure. And, I'm his only remaining son. Both of my brothers passed away, and he kind of just lives by himself in a condo in Lowell, Massachusetts. And happily, he's not like miserable there, but he's a pretty isolated dude. And so I decided I was just going to drive up and surprise him. And I even had like a little scheme where I had my uncle, his brother, a few days before I arrived, just to make sure that he was expecting someone. I didn't want to scare him to death by startling him. He doesn't get like visitors for no reason. And I had my uncle call him and say, "Hey, I need to swing by and drop something off." And my dad's like, "Oh, okay, I'll make coffee for you." So he was expecting somebody. Then, of course, I actually showed up at the condo, and my dad had gotten the day wrong, so wasn't expecting his brother that day anyway. So I almost did give him a heart attack, which, but it was it was really nice. And his reaction, which I posted on Twitter, I was expecting him to, not necessarily burst into tears, but I was expecting something a little more emotional instead of what I got, which was very funny of him just, first of all, not recognizing me at first. He's like, who is it, Chris? and kind of just very charmingly saying that he didn't realize that Dick was coming. My Uncle Dick, he didn't realize he was coming that day, and offered to let me come into his house. Didn't ask me in, just said I could come in if I wanted to. But yeah, it was a special moment, and him reacting the way he did was my dad in a nutshell, for sure.
That was I loved watching that and getting to know you so well and seeing you interact. That's always interesting to watch people, and the fact that you filmed it, I loved it. You guys went to see a movie too, which is another experience that a lot of people.
My favorite moment in the last few months. My dad and I are not hyper sentimental. I mean, we're very close in terms of sharing stuff with each other, but both of us kind of have a first do no harm approach to life. Like I'm constantly like, am I annoying you right now? Like I can leave you alone. And he's the same way. And so therefore sometimes we're not as engaged as we should be because we're worried about annoying the other person. But we once saw Nobody, the Bob Odenkirk ultra action flick. And I didn't know how he was going to react to it, but he fucking loved it. And if you've seen it, first of all, it's a lot of fun. It's a comedy. You have to go into it knowing it's a comedy. my dad was wheezing laughing at just like, some dude's finger getting snapped back or, something awful. And he was just losing his mind laughing. And I think I've come to realize over the years that hearing my dad laugh is probably the single biggest thing that got me into comedy. When I look back, so many of my cherished family memories, of which I have about 8 at most, involve making my dad laugh in some capacity.
I remember
I remember once being at the table. It was my older brother and I think my younger brother wasn't older brother, dad, and my mom. And
I lost that last part. You were at the table.
Sorry,
no, it's the feed.
We were having dinner, and it was my older brother and my dad and my mom. And my mother was she was mentally ill, and so she would fly off the handle a lot or whatever. And I'm not trying to besmirch her memory. She's God bless her, R.I.P. But we were at the dinner table, and she asked me for the salt and pepper. And I just instinctively went to salt my own food before handing it to her. And she just lost it. She flew off the handle like, you don't do that. When somebody asks you for salt and pepper, you don't use it yourself. You give it to them. And she made a real big scene about it. So I handed it to her. And then as she was lifting up the salt to salt her food, I said, "Hey, Mom, can I have the salt and pepper?" And I watched my dad, who would try to avoid making Mount Vesuvius erupt, just start shaking, like holding in his laughter. Just could not, because I was probably 6 or 7 at the time. And I think that was the first time that I can remember where I thought like, ooh, this is like charge. Like this is, and she was so angry, but she was almost laughing too, just because she understood that I like zinged her. And so, that's kind of all apropos of nothing, but I like it. Yeah, I mean, hearing my dad laugh is like a cure for what ails me, for sure.
One more thing I wanted to ask you about, because you were tweeting about this, and this is obviously a story we've talked a little bit about it, but over the years. But the marijuana legalization in New York City, cannabis is legal, and there's still people that are concerned, serious people like David Frum and Patrick Kennedy and the New York Post. Same old arguments, but it's just, at what point do we really stop the resistance? Will it be over? There's still
every time. Yeah. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that there's still people in prison for marijuana possession in certain places. Dwayne Wright, this kid who was killed by the cops, apparently he had a marijuana possession charge on, Dante, forgive me. It's just so absurd. I can't believe anybody's still talking about this, but there's some gateway argument.
Well, that would have to, people would have to admit that they were wrong, and they can't. They would have to admit that the where they planted their flag 10 years ago has been revealed to be absurd. Oh, every time one of those new states talks about legalizing marijuana, everyone acts as if there's no evidence to analyze this. At this point we have, I don't know how many years ago, Colorado and a couple of the other states legalized marijuana, but we now have a pretty large base of information about the pros and cons of marijuana legalization. But these people, they act like, they think they do this Chicken Little shit that the sky's going to fall. It's like, well, it hasn't fallen anywhere else. Where are these massive? All I can see is a massive tax revenue, and you're putting a bunch of low-level drug dealers out of business. Where is the problem here?
Yeah, jobs and medicine for people. Now, the other one I was thinking of is this guy Alex Berenson, who wrote a whole book about it, and he was on with Tucker Carlson, and they were just talking about the dangers of it, and the entire internet laughed at them. And I just can't imagine being that person in 2021 saying weird, crazy shit about weed that everybody knows is not true.
I don't think that the topic is verboten, and I think that there's certain issues. One of the things that in this New York Post op-ed, this inane New York Post op-ed, where he talks about just the smell permeating the city, and kids walking to school, and there's some legitimate issues there. I don't mind the smell of marijuana because I smoke marijuana, but I can see that might be a drag on every corner because it's a very pungent, very identifiable smell. And I could see someone, but that's not the sky is falling argument. That is a quality of life argument. It is not a reason to make something legal or illegal. My personal annoyance at a smell I don't like.
There's a lot to say about cannabis and laws around it, but in the end, the question is winners and losers, and like any other policy, and there's just so much more winning.
It is a massive net positive. It's like it's catastrophically a net positive. Extremely, like the opposite of catastrophically.
All right, man.
The argument that good.
Yeah, what were we gonna say?
I was just going to say that in that gateway argument, which is what my little Twitter spat with that dude was about, is the guy who wrote the article. It's such an inane argument because, of course, marijuana seems, he said like every hardcore drug abuser claims to have started with marijuana. And, that might be inconvenient, but like, tell me I'm wrong. It's like, well, yeah, because you have to buy marijuana from drug dealers. Like if every time you walked into Wendy's and ordered, a chicken sandwich, they tried to upsell you crystal meth, then Wendy's would be, if you're buying your marijuana from a dispensary or from like a fucking CVS, it's not, you're not walking around CVS being like, well, I got my marijuana. Now it's time for me to up,
No, it would be far more. If you're buying your marijuana from CVS, it's a gateway into those plastic toothpick things.
Exactly.
You can't leave without those. Do you use those? They're terrible for the environment. My wife always buys them though.
I don't like them. I like the solid, good wooden toothpicks.
Oh, okay. I mean the plastic thing with the string in it.
Oh yeah, no, I don't like those. I mean, I like just a standard floss.
Huh.
All 6 times a year that I floss.
This week,
you're like an everyday flosser, aren't you, Pete? You have great teeth.
I wouldn't be if it weren't for those stupid plastic things. I hate plastic, but my wife keeps getting, and I leave one in here in the studio, and
smart.
And it's worth a lot of money, that one right now.
Oh God, it smells terrible.
It's awful. I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry. I know we got to go, but I will say one of the most impactful things anyone has ever said to me about personal hygiene was John Tesh, the musician John Tesh, the former Entertainment Tonight host John Tesh, and he said, floss your teeth once and then smell the dental floss. It's like that is in your mouth all the time, and I have flossed at least 3 times as much ever since he said that because it always gets on my mind. It's like, yeah, that stuff is in your mouth, and it's awful.
I have a confession.
Yes.
I took a woman on a date
to a John Tesh concert
to see John Tesh at Carnegie Hall.
Wow. You really don't know anything about music.
And I'm not done. It was phenomenal. He ran up and down the aisles with some kind of electric keyboard.
It is honestly totally elitist douchebaggery for me to even say that. Because, I mean, clearly he records music and people love it. He was kind of a cultural punching bag for a long time. But, I've seen as much as the next guy.
I've seen Bowie, Prince, and David Tesh in concert.
John Tesh.
Him too. The joke is gone. I never saw Bowie or Prince. I fucked it up because I called him by the wrong goddamn name.
You fucked up, dude. Nice job.
Christian Finnegan, always a pleasure. Have great shows this weekend. I'm excited to hear about them next week.
Thanks, pal. Talk to you soon.
There he goes. Tickets still available for, I think, tonight's shows at the DC Improv, which is a great, great comedy club. I'll be plugging J.L. Covan's dates, and I'll be booking some myself pretty soon, I'm sure, as well. I'm just dragging my feet. I really just don't want to go back on the road. I love doing it, but you know what else I love? My weekends after doing this podcast 5 days a week. But we'll see. I'll do some dates for sure, and I hope to see you out there. And I love being on the road, but I also love being home. Here we go now with my next guest. He is a very smart dude with a lot of experience and credibility. He's a civil rights lawyer and an author. He's been working in communities of color across the country to address issues of systemic racism for years and years, and he has supported dozens of grassroots-led efforts to end mass criminalization and incarceration, achieve education equality, dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline, protect immigrants' rights, and create a more inclusive and participatory democracy. He's a college professor. He's at the University of Denver as well, and his new book is fantastic. I've learned so much from reading it, and I've just barely gotten into it enough to do a decent interview with him. The book is Rich Thanks to Racism, How the Ultra-Wealthy Profit from Racial Injustice. Jim is online at jimofreeman.com. Here we go for the last conversation of the week, and the one I probably learned the most from. Well, good place to start this conversation because you're in Colorado, because you're at the University of Denver, where you direct something called the Social Movement Support Lab at iRise. Is that right?
That's right.
Am I saying it right? What is this initiative?
Yeah, so what we do is we partner with communities of color across the U.S. that are fighting against systemic racism and looking to create positive social change. So, I help them with research and with policy and communications and strategy and at earlier times in my career, legal issues as well. And, these are typically grassroots campaigns led by people who are most directly affected by systemic racism. These are campaigns to end mass criminalization and incarceration, to achieve education equity, to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, to really create a more inclusive and participatory democracy. And then really for the last 5 or 6 years in particular, my work has been focused on helping communities that are trying to make sure that public investments are aligned with community priorities and community needs. So, for example, instead of investing heavily in the criminalization of people of color in particular, we're trying to address the dramatic underinvestment in the systems and strategies that would create healthier, safer, and more equitable communities nationwide.
Very well explained. That's a very important initiative, which I'm sure there's a lot of research behind it being effective in terms of supporting grassroots, as opposed to trying to top down and coming into a community and saying, listen, we've got all the experience, we've got all the resources. It doesn't work that way. It's like fighting an insurgency. You have to understand the people that live in the community and what they want to win their hearts and minds. And so they have to be included. The best way to do it would be to take what they've already started in their communities and give them the resources. How am I doing in explaining the converse of what you just did?
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, I've been doing this work for a long time, so I feel like I can contribute. I have something to contribute to the discussion about, what the problem is and how we might solve it. But I also know that I can't do that as well as people who've been living with that their whole lives, right? Who know these systems inside and out, who know how they've affected them, how they continue to affect them. And so I really think that the best solutions and the best diagnoses are always coming from the communities who are most directly impacted by these issues.
I wonder if my metaphor for insurgency was too far, but it does. I mean, I think a lot about foreign policy. I think and talk with a lot of experts and, hearing about pulling out of Afghanistan. It's like, you look at situations like, I wonder if that's fair. It's a community that exists. You, Jim Freeman, can punch in and out of that community whenever you want. They live there. They're never going anywhere. And I'm talking about, thinking about the people of Afghanistan. Like, we can go in there and do whatever we think is right to help them, but then we leave. And in this case, this is what a lot of well-meaning people and organizations do. But in your case, you're trying to actually support them from the bottom up?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really exciting right now that there's so many people who are, coming into this work, this racial justice movement, and particularly white folks. Like, we need that to happen. We need more white people to recognize the importance of the issue and how it's interconnected with what they face. But one thing we really have to avoid is this tendency to sort of colonize or gentrify the racial justice movement. And, we need lots of different kinds of leaders in different spaces, but we have to be very honest about the fact that as white people, we don't make very good leaders in these spaces. It's, like I said, I think I have a lot of experience. I have things to contribute, but I also miss stuff. And I miss stuff that people who've lived with this stuff their whole life, they don't miss. And so, I think while we have to be contributing in far greater numbers, we also have to make sure that we're not coming in and acting like we're going to be the white saviors or whatever.
Yeah, I want to get to the specifics of the book, which is so good and so important and so groundbreaking. Rich Thanks to Racism. I've already told everybody about it in the introduction, a little bit about you, Jim, but I do want to just spend a couple more minutes on you. You're a guy who does undergraduate at Notre Dame, goes to Harvard Law School, editor at the Harvard Law Review. You clerk for a judge on the Ninth Circuit, which is an interesting place. You're an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and now you're at University of Denver. You're a highly educated guy. Like, there's no better education than the one you've gotten. But I imagine now, I'm making assumptions about all of this, that your work experience as a civil rights lawyer is what has educated you most on what the problems are. How true is that? And let's get into what you've done.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. I got into this work because with the understanding that our opponents were ignorant, that their opponent was ignorance. In other words, I believe that all we had to do was to educate people on the realities of racial inequity, on the realities of systemic racism and how to address them. And that would be enough to fix these glaring issues. And because that was sort of the education that I received, right? I had a good enough education to know that there were these gross racial inequities, but I wasn't actually taught how to solve those problems in a real way, in a transformative and really sustainable way. And I only really learned that by working with folks on the ground who deal with this stuff every day, who live it every day. My best teachers over the years have been, the community leaders that have really been sort of my tour guides as a white person, my tour guides into what this stuff looks like, what they confront on a day-to-day basis, what the power structure looks like that's upholding it and defending it. And that's really where I've learned the stuff that I tried to share in the book. It was only by finally recognizing how naive I was to think that, I'll just let people know what these inequities look like. And then, people's good intentions will take over and we'll solve them together. It doesn't work like that.
Well, the one of the reasons I want to have you illustrate kind of a little bit about your experience is that so often we get our educations on these really important controversial issues through pundits, through commentators, from cable news to your favorite podcast, YouTube commentator, or often politicians themselves that say that they identify problems in speeches and in commentary that they're part of. But someone like you is no joke. Like, you actually have worked within these communities for years and years. And so you're not just saying the stuff to get likes and hits and make money in media or to win a political office. So I think it's super important that you have written this book because you have seen with your own eyes, with your own life experience, the problems, and you have to share in I think an academic, scholarly research, but in a way that certainly someone who's like me, who's not a scholar, can understand and be moved by. This is a very groundbreaking book, and I think it's super important that people understand how important your experience is, lived experience, work experience is in instructing this. So I know that you're not here to talk about yourself and be flattered, but I do want to make the point about somebody else or yourself in terms of why that experience educates or made you want to write this book.
Well, I think, my heroes and the people that I look to as real leaders on this stuff are, like I said, the folks from the communities most directly impacted by systemic racism. Those are the folks who've taught me virtually every worthwhile thing that I know. And all of that came after all the degrees that you mentioned. And, I wanted to be really clear about that in the book. It's a policy book in a way, but what I didn't want to do is like every other policy book is just give, my ideas about how to solve these issues. What I wanted to do in the book was use that as a platform to lift up the solutions that have been identified by the real leaders on the ground. And what I also wanted to do is encourage folks, particularly folks who are newer to these issues and maybe haven't been contributing actively to the racial justice movement, is if you want to address them, both how they're affecting communities of color and how they're also affecting you, even if you aren't in one of those directly impacted communities, the best thing to do is to invest in those organizations, the grassroots organizations that are working on this stuff, 24/7, 365. That's where, the real change is happening. That's where the real leadership is.
I'm white. I live in Vermont. My wife is white. My 2 kids are white. I care a lot about race and racism. I absolutely see the inequities and the injustices. But why am I going to care this much to read your book, much less get involved? Because I'm not directly affected by the racism profiteers.
Yeah, I mean, what I think we have to also recognize, and I tried to make this point in the book, is that, what the book is really about how this group of ultra wealthy folks, these billionaires and multimillionaires, how they're profiting off of racism, right? But I think we all have to understand that their portfolio is far more diversified than that. And that was really made apparent to me as I was researching this book and how they were, investing in these policies that were upholding systemic racism. And as I learned more about where they direct their money and the ideology that guides those decisions, I realized how heavily invested they are in pushing a political agenda that has been deeply harmful to most white folks as well. So in other words, if white people examine the reasons their lives are far more difficult than they need to be, they eventually run into the same set of organizations and individuals who are leading the opposition against racial equity. But the other thing I would say is that that you may not be directly impacted by these issues the same way that, the communities I work with in Oakland or Baltimore or Chicago or Los Angeles or whatever, the way they're affected. But I think we all need to get to the point where we see that, education inequities and mass incarceration and anti-immigrant policies and all these other issues, they don't just harm the folks who are, in the eye of the storm, so to speak. If we all examine our lives closely, I think we can find evidence of the harm caused by the reverberations from those unjust systems. And then on the flip side, we also need to recognize that addressing those issues doesn't just help the Black and brown communities who have the burden of systemic racism lifted off them. We all stand to benefit when our neighbors are able to live higher quality lives.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, what about just the idea that even though I understand the problems to some extent, and I'm sympathetic to them and I hate them, what about the fact that I might be contributing to them without knowing it? And it's easy to think about it from a standpoint of something like climate change and sustainability in terms of, how you consume, if you have an electric car, if how sustainable you're living, if you're eating meat and so on. And I'm not here to shame anybody, by the way, for contributing to any bad thing. I don't like that. We would never be able to live our lives if we only bought clothes from, if we only supported certain labor practices. I mean, by the way, that's a privileged way to live, right? Only bought organic food and so on and so forth. But I do think that there are politicians and policies that I support for this reason, not realizing, or just private, more importantly, probably private sector companies, investments I might make that are actually contributing to the problem. How about that I wouldn't think that I'm contributing to the problem, but I am this way or that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. What I say in the book is that the driving force behind these policies and practices are the ultra wealthy, are organizations like ALEC, are, the Koch brothers and their network that are investing tens of millions of dollars into these various think tanks and advocacy organizations and media outlets that are lifting up these ideas and these policies. They are the driving force, but they're only successful because they essentially deputize the rest of us into supporting them. Their priorities wouldn't hold water if the rest of us weren't casting votes for the politicians that they support, if we weren't upholding a public dialogue, a public narrative that is supportive of systemic racism. And so the reason why I wrote the book is to try and expose some of this. So hopefully it dawns on people how they are unwittingly, in many cases, contributing to these efforts, so that we can shift the balance a little bit and really start putting forward an agenda that is far more responsive to the needs and values of, low-income people, working class people, and middle-class people.
Jim, I'm going to teach you something right now about media and the difference between radio and podcasts. In radio, you have to reset. You have to be like, all right, everybody, I'm talking to Jim Freeman, because people might have just gotten in their car and tuned in. But a podcast, people generally know, hey, my guest today is Jim Freeman. You selected this episode. Yet, I still like to reset, and subtly to longtime listeners, I do this with books I really want them to buy by saying, the book is rich thanks to racism, how the ultra wealthy profit from racial injustice. I'm talking to Jim Freeman. So that's my little secret for people. So that's the reset to get into it, which is, you mentioned the Koch brothers, and it's interesting because they are evil for many reasons, but mostly for their, contributions, I think, to just tax policy and specifically to creating a legislative agenda that allows them to pollute the world, for sure. They're very much investors in climate change denial, fossil fuels, chemicals, and they're huge. But they're also known to be kind of liberal on criminal justice issues because they're libertarians, and so it's their ideology. So they've been instrumental in certain things. So I was surprised to read how they contribute to this. Help me understand how, because I thought the libertarians, the Cato Institute, and the Koch brothers were kind of overlapped with the folks who want to, legalize drugs for one and end this mass incarceration. What do we learn?
Yeah, well, for me, it's helpful to think about.
Let me go on defending the Koch brothers for a couple more minutes.
Yeah, we can make it about that. I think about it in terms of, we can talk about it in terms of Dante Wright, the young man who was killed by police outside Minneapolis on Sunday, right? So it's almost been 1 year since George Floyd was killed. Mm. And we heard over and over after that it was a wake-up call for the nation, right? But, here's the thing. We didn't actually wake up, right? If we had, we would have come together as a country around real solutions to these issues, around our perverse public investment strategies, in which we, overinvest in the criminalization of people of color. But we didn't do that. And because of it, because we couldn't summon the collective urgency to address those issues, now Dante Wright is dead, not even a year later. But let's talk about why we haven't addressed them, why we haven't addressed those issues. It's not because we don't know how. It's not because we don't have the solutions. It's because there's a very well-funded opposition that stands in the way. So you have organizations like ALEC, which the Koch brothers have been funding heavily and really sustaining for decades, that represents hundreds of the largest corporations in the U.S. that worked for decades to pass these various tough on crime policies that led to the system we have now. You have folks like the Koch brothers and all the other billionaires that have organized.
Just on ALEC, what they do is they're very effective, my understanding, in states. And what they actually do is, on behalf of several corporations' interests, they literally write laws, give them to state legislators, and then those state legislators pass the law. So in effect, if I were to simplify it the way only a pundit could, these corporations are really writing the laws in these states and then benefiting from that. I just wanted to punctuate what ALEC is doing. I think that's my recollection of kind of what they do.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And thanks for explaining that. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 of the largest corporations in the world, and something like 2,000 legislative members, mostly from state legislatures around the country. They generate about 1,000 bills a year in state legislatures across the country and pass about 200 of them.
They generate bills.
Yeah, it's a factory for bills that support their interests. And a big chunk of them, around which they've been hugely successful, are these sort of tough on crime policies. So that's a huge part of the sort of legal infrastructure of the system that killed George Floyd and killed Dante Wright. So then you have the Koch brothers and the folks they've organized, putting tens of millions of dollars into various right-wing think tanks and advocacy organizations that have been pushing this agenda, mass criminalization and incarceration agenda, for decades and continue to do so today. So one of those think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, after the uprising last summer, against systemic racism. What they decided to do was launch a Back the Blue police pledge that has now been signed by 200 members of Congress. So 200 members of Congress who have vowed to continue supporting the status quo in law enforcement in this country, and also helping to make police the enormously powerful political force that they are. So in other words, these folks they're organizing not to stop people from being killed, but in support of the people responsible for killing them. And, one of those members of Congress who signed that legislation was Senator Tom Cotton, one of the most powerful and influential Republicans in the country. He tweets out just the other day that in the U.S. we have a major under-incarceration problem.
Yeah. My violent fantasies in reaction to that tweet are not something I want to say on the record.
Yeah, but he's been saying it for years.
Yeah. Nope.
And, so you put all that together and how folks have really invested in the system and are continuing to defend it today. And that's really what modern day systemic racism looks like. We implement these public policies that we know for a fact will inflict needless harm on large groups of people of color, that we know will perpetuate racial inequity, that we know will lead to people getting killed. And then when that harm becomes apparent, we fail to address it appropriately, in significant part because it's economically beneficial.
I feel like you're maybe using the word "we" in a way that it doesn't deserve, because I think most people are pretty apathetic or ignorant to what you're talking about, which is why your book is so important. And I think hopefully this is something that will help them wake up so that we then can feel more comfortable saying we know that these things are happening, because we don't. We really don't, most of us, because they don't affect us directly.
Right. And that's, like you say, that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. And I don't distance, I don't separate myself from that. I was the same way. It took me a long time to reach the point where, I started to see how in my own life I was contributing to some of these dynamics. And so, it's a process for everybody.
Were there any for you? Were there any moments, crucible moments, aha moments, experiences, or was it more of a gradual, you just kept seeing stuff?
Yeah. For me, honestly, like I said, where I started out, I thought, I'll just educate people out of systemic racism. And if I'd been, if I'd only been working in one geographic area, let's say I was working in, Chicago or wherever, I would probably still believe that. But because I work across many cities and states and really in every region of the country, I began to see patterns, honestly, in the opposition that we face. So I'd be in one place, let's say like Tallahassee, Florida, and there'd be this really harmful education policy, this like new innovative, thing that came down. And then the next week I'd be in Springfield, Illinois or Denver or somewhere, and I'd see the same policy with the same language, and so I started digging a little bit and starting to follow the money a little bit. And I realized that it's the same small group of people who are really investing in these things and spreading them across the country in ways that are creating enormous harm. So, that was a real game changer for me to realize that there were actual people who were the driving force behind this stuff. And it, like I said, it used their wealth to essentially deputize so many of the rest of us in advancing the policies that I'd seen cause enormous suffering.
In your book, Rich, Thanks to Racism, How the Ultra Wealthy Profit from Racial Justice, Jim Freeman, you write about criminal justice, immigration, and education. You cover those kind of three topics, and it's so fascinating. I've barely gotten into it, and I can't wait to talk to you again after I'm done with it, hopefully. But I think most people, if we were going to pick those three, are at least a little familiar with the criminal justice injustices. But and to some extent, maybe immigration, but certainly not. I learned so much in reading your book, but definitely not with education. So I wanted to spend a little bit more time on those two, and then I want, I'm just looking at the clock, get to solutions too. So let's just talk about how the rich, the ultra wealthy, profit from racial injustice when it comes to education and our school and ed policies.
Yeah. So, what I really talk about in the book is this sort of school privatization movement, right? The push to really expand charter schools and school voucher programs, and the harm that that's causing to public schools and the families that depend on them, because a lot of those schools are being, they're being closed because so much of our money is going into these new shiny charter schools and school voucher initiatives. So, what I did in the book, and this was, talk about aha moments, this was one for me where I just picked 10 billionaires. You know, there's some who have gotten a lot of publicity over the years for investing in these things. Folks like the Walton family and Bill Gates and folks like that.
In charter schools. And the charter school movement.
Yeah. So I looked at them, and then I looked at, but then there were other folks that I didn't know were invested in this area at all, like the Koch brothers, for example, or Mark Zuckerberg, or Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix. I just took 10, and I looked at just 50 organizations that they've been funding that have been advancing this movement, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years. And so I just tracked how much money those 10 sources contributed to those 50 organizations, which is just a small fraction of the whole picture. And I was able to track $3.2 billion in investments from those 10 sources into this effort. And that blew me away because, on one hand, in my normal work, I was working with these communities around the country in Newark, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, and, other cities, and, Black and brown communities that were really devastated by these dynamics with the schools being closed and the trauma that was causing and the just mass confusion about how they're going to get their kids, into school. And in New Orleans, another city that's now 100% charter schools. So I was seeing all this pain and suffering and hurt caused by this. And at the same time, I saw, this incredible amount of money where you can't deny that, however you might feel about charter schools or vouchers, like this was undoubtedly a billionaire-led effort. And then I started breaking down how folks are actually profiting from that, how they profit directly from privatized education systems, how they benefit indirectly by the fact that we're investing less in schools in those communities that are being privatized, therefore reducing their own tax bills. And really the devastation that was having on the ground. So that was a real eye opener for me.
Well, but a lot of people will listen and I think to some extent your Zuckerbergs and your Bill Gates and the others believe that charter schools are a great way to fight racism and give opportunity to young Black kids. And that's why they invest in them. I think we have a tremendous amount of evidence now that that's not true, especially in somewhere like Newark, where they had all of the money in the world and they completely fucked it up. And a lot of people who invested, I think, even admit to that at this point. But how are charter schools contributing to profiting off of racial injustice? The way I look at that issue, the easiest way to explain it is that they pick winners. So yes, some Black kids are getting a great education. That as opposed to the traditional public school model, which is very flawed for a lot of reasons in terms of curriculum and bureaucracy, blah, 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 but still gives a way better opportunity or chance to most people, much less Black people. How did I do there?
You do great. No, I think you're right. And, I don't doubt the good intentions of, somebody like Mark Zuckerberg or somebody like Bill Gates. I actually think they believe that what they were doing was going to help
Cory
people.
Booker, I think, was very involved.
Yeah. Also, and I also don't doubt that there were some people who actually did benefit. But, up until researching this book, I had no idea that, for example, the Koch brothers were heavily invested in this agenda because they've never, as far as I can tell, they've never been publicly connected to the agenda. And yet here they are dedicating hundreds of millions of dollars to it. And, I think it's safe to say that, there's not much evidence that their political ideology is the same as Bill Gates's or Mark Zuckerberg's. And yet here they are not only funding the same movement, but funding the exact same organizations in a lot of cases. And, they've been very clear over the years on what they believe. And in fact, if you look back at David Koch's presidential run that they made in 1980, if you look at the agenda that they were trying to advance in their very unsuccessful campaign, what they actually argued for was no public investment in education at all, right? And so, I think it's very clear that the agenda they're trying to advance is eliminating public education entirely. And it just so happens that what Bill Gates is doing, what Mark Zuckerberg is doing, is actually, whether they intend to or not, is actually supportive of that agenda.
Yeah, well, it's because they privatizing things that have been traditionally public in the United States and still are in most of Western Europe and places like Japan, Israel, Australia. is more efficient. It's more, you use this word a lot in the book and talk about efficiencies a lot. And I think a lot of that stuff is counterintuitive to corporate giants that are constantly thinking about the bottom lines and statistics. And I'll never forget my uncle who had a PhD in education, a big lefty out in California, told me 100 years ago, he's like, there should be no incentive for profit in the world of education, in public education, certainly in lower ed, none whatsoever. That is what's wrong with it. So what's wrong with making things more efficient? And what's wrong with making things more competitive? Doesn't that make things more innovative?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be very clear about the lies that we tell to communities of color, right? Because, in the education system, if, as school privatization advocates suggest, that charter schools are inherently superior to public schools, then why were the most aggressive initial efforts entirely directed at communities of color? In other words, if there was something intrinsically special about the charter school model, about this competitive model, then don't predominantly white, affluent suburbs also deserve to benefit from it? And if those schools are so effective, if this is actually adding something beneficial, then why didn't the billionaires driving these efforts focus on building charter schools in their own communities? Right? I think the answer is pretty obvious, is that, that communities with well-resourced public schools aren't interested in these, what are really like superficial and affirmatively harmful reforms. And I think folks who've been paying attention know that Black and brown communities were targeted for these efforts because, one, they've been so thoroughly disempowered politically over the years that they wouldn't be able to resist as much as other communities. Two, that school privatization advocates wouldn't face as much public scrutiny for implementing their reforms in communities of color. And three, like after decades of really neglecting and undermining the public schools within communities of color, many people in those communities would be desperate enough to try anything. So at the end of the day, like, these young people of color, these families in these communities have been used as a proof point so that charter schools and school voucher programs could gain enough of a toehold to subsequently expand more broadly and take this public system that, from the perspective of corporate America, is, like you say, inefficient because it's not generating profits for them. They could privatize it more. They could profit off of it more. They could cut expenses, which from their perspective, it's inefficient to meet every kid's developmental needs. It's inefficient to pay a unionized labor force.
Small class sizes, I think, is the best way. Yeah. That's inefficient. No, get a bunch of kids in there and fucking pump them out like a factory on a conveyor belt, just like we do our cars.
Or teach them over computers. Now this is our life, but they were pushing that before COVID, right? These sort of virtual charter schools.
But all these arguments are so convincing to a lot of people because there's a grain of truth. You can learn certain things over a computer just as well, if not better. You can learn in a charter school just as well, if not better, which is why you see a close-knit Black urban community knows that the Johnson family, their kid went to this charter school and she's doing great. And so then they have these fucking disgusting lotteries where you see a whole bunch of Black families and they lose their minds with joy and elation when they get in. But in effect, with the rest of the families, it's the Hunger Games. It's actually reprehensible. You see the one family celebrating, but everybody else is left behind. That's the way I see that.
Exactly. We do have to be clear that, we've never had an equitable education system in this country. It's never been true.
Right. In public education. You're right.
Public education, private education, put it all together like into one system. Like,
because we support it with property taxes. I mean, like, of course we don't. Right.
Yeah. And so, I totally understand people's willingness to latch on to this, to latch on to charter schools or vouchers or whatever.
Of course.
But what's really happening with this school privatization effort is it's an escalation of the problem we've always faced, which is our schools have never been designed, like we think of them as youth development institutions, but they've never actually been that. They've never been funded like that, structured like that, operated like that. But they should be. But what happens with the school privatization movement is it creates, like you say, this sort of system of winners and losers. And this, instead of taking this perspective of abundance, that we have enough to educate everybody, it creates this, this illusion of scarcity where we have to fight for, the seats in the good schools. And, I think it's really insidious how it's pitting people against each other.
Yes. Great word. Great. Yes, absolutely. It is. It's terrible. That's exactly what I was trying to say there. It is insidious. So we talked about criminal justice. We talked about education. You have a hard out in 3 minutes. I didn't even get to immigration, but I've got to get to solutions, and you have to commit to part 2 with me, because I've barely scratched the surface on just a couple of chapters.
Sold.
And it's so important to talk about the rest of this book, and everybody needs to get it. But let's go ahead and fast forward right now just to a couple of solutions that you think that people listening can get involved with. They should all buy the book because you can learn more in detail. But there's a whole bunch that you do offer in conclusion and in each chapter about what can be done, what should be done. So with just these couple minutes, take it and give me any top line you want.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, like the easy part is the policy solutions around those various issues. Criminal justice, immigration, education. I lift up some of the ideas that are being put out there by the folks who are most directly impacted. That's in one way, in one sense, the easy part. The harder part is addressing the bigger issue of power. Right. And how a small number of people are really exerting an enormous influence over these systems, exponentially more than, any average person who's actually affected by these systems. So what I say in the book is that, there's really only one effective counterweight to that kind of power, the power of organized wealth. And that's the power of organized people. So to really resist this agenda and ultimately advance one that's more favorable to low-income, working class, and middle-class families, we need to build people-powered organizations. That's really the difference between winning and losing, between having a powerful organized force pushing for change and just having a large number of sort of isolated voices in the wilderness. So what I say in the book is probably the most valuable thing that any one person can do would be to find racial justice organizations in their area or ones that are working nationally, grassroots groups that are leading these efforts, and really invest in them with their time, with their energy, and with their money if they can. But then we also need to create new structures for more people to become involved. And so one thing I recommend is every community can create what I call a community equity assembly, where just regular people can come together to learn about these issues, and then get to work in dismantling them. These don't need to be formal bodies. And they don't need to be large, just places where community members can gather together.
I love that. When I read about that, I was like, I want to get involved. And on your website, jimofreeman.com, action steps section, you have a whole bunch of organizations, national and local, across the country. But I would just suggest, sometimes we want to go launch something, but I would suggest, a lot of times there already is something. And certainly if you want to fight racial injustice, you generally want it to be led by people of color, and you want to jump on and support them however you can. So great list of organizations, amazing book. And I invite you to join me again, hopefully really soon. Jim, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pete. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, there goes Jim Freeman for the first time. I will definitely be having him back for a part 2. Go get his book, all the information, of course, in the show notes. And that is all I've got for you for the week and for today. But I will be hanging out tonight at 9 p.m. I'll be out in the shed. I'll go on Zoom. I'd love to see you there. If you're not already a subscriber, sign up. You'll get the link. You can hang out with us. It's often magical, always a lot of laughs, a lot of jokes, a lot of making fun of me, and we learn a lot about each other and about life, and I'd love to have you hanging out and being a part of that community. So go sign up right now, paid subscription link in the show notes, or head over to patreon.com/PeteDominic. Also, do me a huge favor and check out the ad. Just go log into indeed.com/standup so I get credit for that, because they're going to help me hire somebody to work on this show and make it better, I hope. I mean, they're going to pay me. Yeah, and then also, I need you to write a review for the podcast. Go to Apple Podcasts and write a review if you haven't already. That's it. Out of time. See you tonight. Love you. You're never alone. If you're a stand-up community member, you can always hang out with us on the Discord platform, and I will talk to you on Monday right here on Stand Up Pete Dominic Daily. Now take it away, John Carroll.
boy, you better stand up. Stand up. When you're tired of begging, saying pretty please, that's the time you gotta finally get up off of your knees. When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know us right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. This is the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.